without a Christian worldview, without a moral grounding, all we go on is sentimentality, or worse, not thinking about what we should, but only as if we could, in the reversed words of Ian Malcolm.
Mm-hmm.
And in this movie, it's like the big takeaway really is, what is most likely that human beings would do with this kind of power, with this kind of tool, is discriminate using it, and fight with one over it and divide over it. Is like, even at the peak of technology, man will still look at the outside, or even worse, they might even extra focus on the outside, but the Lord looks at the heart, as the book of 1 Samuel says. And so a technology is generally neutral, but it will empower humans to err, or in the biblical sense, missing the mark is the word for sin, right? Or sin is the word for missing the mark. Err in a whole new way. And in our movie, we see that Vincent is now part of a new underclass, no longer determined by your social status or color of your skin. Discrimination is down to a science. And that's the core conflict of this movie, that his dad didn't even want him to have his name, but his dad would give his younger engineered brother his name, Anton.
Yeah. Oof.
And that ties into, right, the biblical parallels aplenty all throughout Scripture. Is that in Scripture you have favored brothers versus God's chosen, all over the place, where you have siblings fighting over love, status, and God's promise. So all the way back in Genesis, there's several main promises that God makes that run through that book. Genesis 3, the heel crusher. God says to the snake, he, talking about a future son, will bruise your head, you shall bruise his heel. Genesis 12, just 9 verses later, God promises to Abraham, through your descendants, I will make a great nation. I will bless them and give them the promised land. All of a sudden, there's something for people to chase after, some goal, some achievement. And then what happens is God's people, instead of working together in peace, fight each other over it, all throughout the book of Genesis. And the rest of Scripture, really. And we see that often an unfavored or smaller or younger son is chosen by God to inherit his promise and do something that has never been done before. Similarly, in this movie, mapped onto Vincent is a similar struggle, is somebody who's considered less than, is chosen, is providently placed, has a gene for fate. No, there's no gene for fate. To achieve something at the pinnacle, which is Gattaca, a pinnacle of human institutions, to go farther than anybody has gone before. And so I guess just thinking about this, when I mention sibling rivalry in the Bible, what pops into your head first?
Usually Cain and Abel is the first one that comes to mind.
Genesis, right? Cain kills Abel.
Yeah.
Any others pop into your head that stick out to you?
I mean, Jacob and Esau are kind of the
Jacob,
boys, I guess.
They
had the longest run.
They have a crazy fight over the blessing. I always like that God gives Jacob the blessedness of Abraham away from his brother. He didn't even need the riches of his parents, but that's a conversation for a different podcast. But you have Cain and Abel, Jacob and Esau, Joseph and all of his brothers later. All of those are stories in Genesis. David and over his own brothers, or over Saul. And even among these stories, another similar element to this movie is that sometimes deception or confusion is part of the plot. So Jacob dresses like Esau. He takes on his identity in order to try to get the blessing. Or a fun one, the left-handed Ehud in Judges 3, because the people are so thick-headed, they don't see that his sword is strapped to the other leg because he's left-handed, and he ends up defeating a big, I call him the Jabba the Hutt of the Bible. Eglon is the fat king. And then ultimately, I think Joseph has a good parallel for Vincent. Joseph at the end of Genesis is a good parallel for Vincent. I mean, he dreams of the stars. He dreams someday of the sun, moon, and stars representing his siblings bowing down to him, of being better than his brothers. And they look at him and go like, "What? You little runt," and they throw him in a hole. Then he's sold as a slave into Egypt, and he's raised to prominence, and eventually that brother ends up saving the rest of his family and doing something that nobody else has ever done. And so these kind of concepts, this story, again, I'm the biblical parallels guy. This movie parallels those really good.